Turn to news from a country where the greatest threat to the homeland is domestic, far-right extremist groups. And there's a massive development to tell you about. 25 people were arrested on suspicion of planning to overthrow the government. Members of an extremist group who believe that their country is being run by a deep state. Individuals who were influenced by QAnon and other right-wing conspiracies, who have taken part in protests against COVID lockdowns. They were plotting to install a shadow government. It all sounds familiar, right? But we are not talking about the United States today. These arrests took place this morning in Germany. According to prosecutors there, this group's mission was to, quote, overcome the existing state order in Germany and to establish its own form of state, the outlines of which have already been worked out. As for how this group felt that goal could be reached, they were apparently planning an armed attack on Germany's parliament building and were prepared to use violence, including possibly killing state representatives. All of these circumstances bear an eerie resemblance to the forces we've seen emerge in our country. Came to a head on January 6th. In fact, a German lawmaker drew parallels to the attack on the U.S. Capitol today. Quote, since January 6, 2021, we have known that anti-democratic speech can also be followed by actions directed against democracy and parliament, he said. Quote, today, the German security authorities have succeeded in putting a stop to such plans to seize power. Now, these arrests are a remarkable demonstration of how potent and dangerous far-right ideologies are all across the globe. What is striking about the news today out of Germany is that something was done about it before the attempt to topple the government occurred, before any clashes took place with law enforcement. A member of Germany's parliament was among those detained, striking another eerie parallel to the alliances between fringe right-wing groups and right-wing politicians. And again, in contrast, those in power in the U.S. who were behind the attempted coup on our democracy, who fueled the flames with disinformation that led the angry mob to storm the Capitol building, have still not been held to account. It's where we begin this hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Ben Rhodes is here. He served as Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. Frank Figliuzzi is also here, former FBI Assistant Director for Counterintelligence. And Katty Kay is here, U.S. Special Correspondent for BBC Studios. All three are MSNBC contributors. When I saw this news break, I asked if all three of you could have this conversation with us. Ben, you write about this in your book, that this clash, this violent clash between democracies and autocracies is global. We can become so self-consumed here in this country. Frank, you've talked about the inadequacy of the toolkit to deal with domestic threats. And Katty, you've been keeping our eyes focused on sort of Europe and the clashes happening there with the elections all year. So I want to start with you, Frank Figliuzzi. Tell me what you understand the details of this plot to be and how they foiled it.
Yeah, boy, this is eerily familiar, is it not? The scenario is uncanny, including the QAnon influence, which I actually had not realized had reached Germany to this kind of penetration level. So look, there's differences and there's distinctions, and the distinction in German law and operation and policy is where we should be focusing. But first, let's compare, and then we'll contrast. So first, like the United States, Germany does not have a distinct, specific domestic terrorism law. They don't have a law that's called domestic terrorism, and neither do we. We still don't. We define it in the law, but we don't have a law against it. They, like us, use existing laws, like bomb-making, assassination, murder, all of that we use. But they did it successfully before it happened. And how do they do that? And here's where the distinction comes in. They actually designate domestic terrorism groups. We do not. And contrary to what many Americans think is that, yeah, sure, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, right, they're all designated by the government, right? No, they're not, because we can't. We don't have a mechanism to do that. Canada, our neighbors to the north, have actually designated Proud Boys as a terrorism group.
Yeah.
We have not, and we can get into why we haven't, right? So what does that allow them to do? It allows them to very early and proactively do things that we simply don't do here. When you're a member of that group, when you're associated or supporting that designated group, they do levels of surveillance and electronic intercepts and wiretaps. They can take your weapon away from you. They do all of that We don't do that, and we can have that discussion about why we don't, but that really enables them to get out in front. They are a serious counterterrorism nation. They get it. Their history of atrocity, of course, makes them keenly sensitive to preventing anything like that from happening again. And the other thing is they swiftly tweak their laws. I mean, they did it in March of this year, Nicole. If they see a threat, they see a gap in the law, they are quick to address that gap.
Well, we used to do that before the threat was so closely associated with our politics. Ben Rhodes, your reaction to this news this morning?
Well, Nicole, as you mentioned, in my last book, I deal with the kind of global spread of this kind of far-right nationalist ideology that we're seeing on both sides of the Atlantic. And to me, what this demonstrates is how much we live in a global information space. So 10 or 15 years ago, an American conspiracy theory like QAnon or other American conspiracy theories about a deep state probably would have been contained in certain corners of American discourse. But now this stuff travels globally on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter. And so people who are susceptible to the same grievances in Germany are consuming the same things that far-right people are consuming in the United States. It speaks to the globalization of these conspiracy theories and ideologies. Another interesting note in the reporting around the German arrest is that Russia was kind of a secondary character. There were efforts to make contact with Russians. I would expect that Russia is stirring the pot and stoking division with disinformation campaigns and amplifying QAnon-type content in Germany in the same way that they are in the United States. We experienced this, by the way, at the end of the Obama administration when they were stoking fears of refugees in Germany and the U.S. in the same way. And so what you see here is the same fuse can be lit in Germany that's lit here in the United States. Again, as Frank said, part of the differences here in the United States is we can't designate groups. We also have kind of almost a tolerance for people stockpiling weapons and having militias and ideologies that, is very risky. And the Germans have a culture not just of laws, but also because of their past, because of their Nazi past, they have tried to put more antibodies into society against something like this. But it should be a warning sign that this could happen anywhere, really in any country, because we are living in such a globalized information space.
Cuddy, something that's striking is the German authorities detain one lawmaker there. We don't know the results of that detention or questioning. But I always think of the assistance that Trump's lies about election fraud received from the Republican members of Congress. I think 131 of them voted to overturn the results of the election after the coup, where they all went running. It's not as though Democrats ran and Republicans in America didn't. In these midterms, 121 of them won re-election. We as a country have made clear that we largely tolerate anti-democratic forces in one of the two political parties. And I'd understood the forces at the political level. I think you enlightened us in Macron's recent election against Marine Le Pen. But to see the penchant for violence in the grassroots in a European country, I don't know why it was so startling. Of course, it's been there all along.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's the arrest and the scale of the intelligence operation, and then watching these videos of them cracking down into houses and taking these people away. And there are a lot of similarities. You're right. I mean, one German lawmaker, centrist German lawmaker today said this is not just about Germany. This is about a threat to parliamentary democracy everywhere. I mean, you're hearing those echoes. My understanding actually is that it's a former member of parliament who was arrested, a woman who was a member of the AfD and is now a sitting judge. I mean, there had been kind of questions about why she was allowed to be a sitting judge because of some of her social media posts that were retweeting QAnon stuff. But that, again, there are similarities. A member of a far-right parliamentary group who had been a member of the parliament there. One active duty soldier was arrested, former members of the police force, former members of the military. And it is this kind of, toxic group of people with links to the security forces who were amongst those arrested. Very similar to what we saw on the attack on January the 6th here. But also, one other thing that I do think is interesting is this group is a real hodgepodge of misinformation. I think Ben is quite right. This is the spread of misinformation online. And at what point do crackpot online conspiracy theories become offline actual violence? And I think that's what we're You know, that's what the Germans felt this was about to become. That is what we saw on January the 6th here. But it's a real mix of conspiracy theories. It's about COVID. It's about vaccines. There's an element of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine there as well as QAnon stuff. And it's just so similar to what we've seen here over the last couple of years. But the Germans acted on it, you know, took it very seriously. And they took it very seriously, in part, clearly, because of what they saw in America.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what's so harrowing. I mean, Frank, you know, the attacker who broke into the Pelosi home was an avid consumer of conspiracy theories. And the fringiest conspiracy theories that we know about, QAnon, were elevated recently. ABC News broke a story today about Trump hosting an event featuring the Pizzagate conspiracy theorist at Mar-a-Lago and elevating this woman. Videos and photos posted to social media appear to show Liz Crokin, a prominent promoter of QAnon and pro-Trump conspiracy theories, speaking at an event at Mar-a-Lago and later posing for photos with Trump. In one photo, the duo, Trump and Liz Crokin, make a thumbs-up sign together. We now have the most prominent figure of one of the country's two political parties elevating conspiracy theories. And to Ben's point about the global reach of mis and disinformation and QAnon specifically, it couldn't have a bigger backer in America. Frank, we can't hear you. I think you got muted. So just unmute yourself and start over. We're going to let Frank work out his audio issues. Can you hear us, Frank?
Have you lost me?
There you go. Start over.
I can hear you, but you
okay,
can't
great.
hear me.
No, start over. You've got all the time in the world. We got you.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So, look, I think these two stories are related. The German raid and Trump continuing to get more and more extreme in who he's meeting with and aligning with. Here's why I think they're not disparate stories. The Germans do what they do very, very well, in part because, as we said, they isolate and identify the extremist threats, particularly the violent threats, right? That's what they hang their hat on. And that enables all kinds of law enforcement techniques. The more that Trump goes extreme, the more he says, yep, this is who I am. I'm meeting with anti-Semites. I'm meeting with a QAnon person. That allows the nation and law enforcement to say, you know what? That's who he is, and it winnows down his base. It really does. As he gets more and more extreme, we're going to see more and more mainstream people just backing off, and that will mean that remaining are people who are signing up for violence. QAnon has a violent ideology. It results tangibly in violent acts. So does anti-Semitism. So does white nationalism. And so that allows law enforcement to say, you know, if we look over here, we're probably going to see people preparing for violence and advocating and supporting violent acts. So if there's any bright spot in what Trump is doing, it's that I think it winnows down the universe of his base to people that law enforcement can say, there's a threat there because we know it's tied to violence.
I guess the other side of it, Ben, is from sort of through the political lens. To legitimize something so dangerous, you massively multiply the number of people consuming absolute BS lunacy, and it only takes one. I mean, the study of terrorism, right, is only one plot has to come to fruition. There can be many, many threats, but they only need to be right one time to endanger all of us, to endanger New York or you know, any of the number of places where terrorism has struck. And to have the bullhorn of the most prominent leader in one of the two political parties, a Republican, doing this conduct. And this is where Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, I think, have the most culpability. It's on the domestic security front by not condemning the meetings with anti-Semites, by not saying, I won't vote for Donald Trump if he runs again in 2024 because he associates with ideas and people that are dangerous. That signal is sent to millions of people that creates a permission structure for that ideology. And again, it only takes one of them to act on it.
That's right. And there's a permission structure that is created by seeing similar language and similar demonization and similar us versus them rhetoric from political leadership that might appeal to people like this in Germany or some of the more extreme people in the U.S. As Katty knows well, if you look at the European far right, you know, you have somebody like a Viktor Orban railing against deep states and immigrants. You have the AfD party in Germany, which is a far-right party that has indulged in extreme anti-immigrant rhetoric. And look, they may not be outwardly advocating for the violent overthrow of governments, but when you start to see some people that have overlapping views of your own speaking about conspiracies and demonizing some of the same people you don't like, it begins to create a permission structure. And when you have a former president of the United States spreading those conspiracy theories and legitimizing these characters, think of how powerful that is. Because this is someone who was in the presidency. So this is someone saying, hey, I was there and I saw the deep state up close. It really does exist. And look, I was the president of the United States, the most visible human being in the world for 4 years, and now I'm meeting with Nazis at Mar-a-Lago. I think it creates an enormous permission structure for people to think, well, maybe this isn't so extreme. Maybe this is something that I can interact with. Maybe this is something I need to look into, do more research of my own on. And suddenly they find like-minded people, and suddenly you have a political problem that becomes a national security threat. And we're in the bizarre circumstance where the national security agencies of countries like the US and Germany and others are dealing with radicalized individuals who are being radicalized by political leaders like Donald Trump or like the AfD in Germany. That's where we are right now. And the democracies have to recognize what that German lawmaker said. This is a threat to parliamentary democracy, to constitutional democracy. It's going to be around for a while. And we have to defend those values in our own communities. And frankly, in looking at social media and the spread of these conspiracy theories, not as like a political issue or do they lean right or left, but as a public health and safety issue as well.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, Caddy, when you lay it all out and you put the side, you line up the two sides, Ben alluded to the Russian element of this. Russia's been fanning the flames of January 6th. I think he even beat Tucker Carlson to the punch in describing Ashley Babbitt as a martyr. It's a message echoed in this country by the far right. You've got the alignment between the Russian disinformation and the mission to divide. Which side is winning, in your view?
Look, I mean, it's a really toxic mix on the other side. I think the midterm elections here in the United States were actually an indication that sanity and centrism and rejection of far-right ideals is winning, certainly in this country. But I think, as you know, Nicole, from your time in the White House, and as Ben is alluding to, it doesn't take very many people. You look at the numbers in Germany. I think this group, the Reichsbürgers, has something like 20,000 people. Authorities estimate 10% of those are far right and 5% of those are violent, potentially. That might not sound like very many, but that's 1,000 people. Now, they had a flashing red light over their heads. They are kind of crackpot and almost like funny. I mean, they wanted to take Germany back to 1871. They had their own ID cards. Some of them had their own currency. I mean, they couldn't have advertised themselves more if they wanted to. But as you know from the White House, the real threat is the lone wolf.
Right.
And that has been the national security threat for all of Europe. It's the small groups that operate by themselves, one or two people, that can cause a huge amount of damage, can kill many, many people. And you only need one lone wolf who operates in a way that is much more undercover than this massive, big, ridiculous group. And then you have real threats to national security that are very hard for security apparatuses to track down. So who's winning? I mean, Americans have just rejected far-right views. They've just rejected threats to democracy in their midterm elections. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to have lone wolves acting in the name of these conspiracy theories post-COVID or whatever the conspiracy theory is, who could slip through the cracks.
Frank, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I think all of this is true. I think this is dangerous. The lone wolf is out there, and he or she's going to be inspired further by Trump. But also true is that we are walking away from this extremism, and it winnows down the base. And yes, it's going to be dangerous, but ultimately, I think we're going to be able to get our hands around this from a law enforcement perspective as this moves forward and Trump continues to say, I'm the person for violence. I'm the person for hate. And I think it's going to get easier, not harder. I think all of it's true.
All right. Well, we'll end there before this takes a darker turn. Ben Rhodes, Frank Figliuzzi, Caddy Kay, thank you so much for starting us off on this story. When we come back, combating anti-Semitism. Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff leading a White House roundtable aimed at stopping the spread of hate crimes and hate speech against Jewish Americans. It